Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session of 30 Minutes with Chugh. My name is Diya Mathews, and I'm an immigration attorney with the Edison office of Chugh LLP. Today, we are going to be talking about birth certificates. What to do about birth certificates from India, what are the options available to you if you don't have one, or if there is an error, and things like that. So I'm very glad we are doing this session because I think I get inquiries about the birth certificate or issues with the birth certificate from India pretty much on a daily basis. And we have an FAQ on this matter, but there's always different scenarios and different situations. Um, as a practical matter, we don't really need the birth certificate until we get to the final stage of the green card process, which for most people is the adjustment of status application or the consular processing through the embassy or the consulate overseas if you choose to go that route. But at that time, at the final stage, you should be prepared to produce a copy of the birth certificate. And I always tell my clients that the lack of what you think is a proper birth certificate should not hold you back from initiating the green card process because it takes a while, and you can work on getting the birth certificate fixed and or obtaining it if that's what you need to do in the meantime. Okay, so let's talk about some of the common questions that we get. One, my birth was not registered. My parents never realized that they had to register my birth, so they never registered it. Or my birth certificate has incorrect information, or my birth certificate doesn't have my name. So those are some of the common questions, and we'll talk more about them. One thing to keep in mind from the standpoint of US immigration is that USCIS looks at what is called the reciprocity schedule published by the Department of State. So that's your starting point when it comes to any documentation, including the birth certificate from India. And let's see what the reciprocity schedule says for India. It says that registration of births was mandatory in India starting from April 1st, 1970. So for anyone born after this date of April 1, 1970, USCIS will expect to see either a proper birth certificate with certain criteria, or they will expect to see what is called a non-availability certificate. And I'll talk more about the non-availability certificate in just a minute. Now, let's say you're one of the lucky ones and your parents or your guardian did register your birth at the time that you were born. Then you can obtain an official birth certificate from the municipality where you were born. The birth certificate is usually issued by the municipal authority or any office that is authorized to issue the birth and death certificates by the registrar of births and deaths in India. The birth certificate should be obtained from the municipality, and sometimes clients will come and they'll produce a birth certificate from the Indian consulate in the US. And now this is usually not acceptable for the 485 or the adjustment filing purpose if the individual was actually born in India. Because if you were born in India, then USCIS expects to see the actual birth certificate that was issued by the municipality in which you were born. Some folks will also produce what is called a community or a nativity certificate. And that talks about the community, the specific community that you were born into. It does have the date of birth of the person, but that again is not acceptable for adjustment filing purposes. The other issue that we have sometimes is that the birth certificate is there, the individual's birth was registered, but it was actually registered a few years after the event of the birth. So then in that case, we have what is called a delayed birth registration. In such cases, the certificate is acceptable, but should be supported by some secondary evidence, such as supporting affidavits from the parents or people who are around at the time of the birth. Okay, so that's for people who actually have a birth certificate and who were lucky. Now, if you were born after April 1, 1970, and you are unable to obtain a birth certificate, then you must obtain what is called a certificate of non-availability. And that's also issued by the local authority, the municipality with jurisdiction over the person's place of birth. The local authority will usually have their own format for the certificate of non-availability, but it will usually say that they conducted a search for the events relating to the birth of this person around this time frame, and no record was found, and will be signed off by the authorized person from the municipality. So if you are able to get a certificate of non-availability, you should also support that with some secondary evidence. And the secondary evidence would typically be affidavits, two notarized affidavits executed by either parent, if they're around, or an older relative who was around at the time of your birth. The affidavits should be notarized, but they do not have to be on stamp paper. So, for many legal documents from India, you have to have stamp paper, but the stamp paper is not a requirement for US immigration. So, it can just be on plain paper. Just make sure it's notarized. Okay. Now, what other secondary evidence can you provide? You can give a school leaving certificate. That's always widely available and is acceptable. That's the documentation from your 10th grade or your 12th grade when you graduated from school. Your baptism certificate, if you have one. Any other records, especially these government issued documents like the ration card, the PAN card, Aadhaar card, or even LIC certificates from back in the day. Those would also be helpful because they have the date of birth of the person. So keep in mind that any document that's contemporaneous with the time of birth, that always carries more weight than a newly created document. Because sometimes people will say, look, I think I can go and get my birth registered now, right? If your birth was never registered, you can definitely go and register it now. But that's a newly created document, so that has less weight with USCIS than a document that is contemporaneous with the time of your birth. Okay. So the other thing, what if you're unable to procure the birth certificate or the non-availability certificate in time for your adjustment filing? So these days with the priority date movements, and it's quite erratic. We don't know how quickly you might be eligible to file for your adjustment. If your adjustment filing window opens up and you find that you don't have enough documentation for your birth, I would say just go ahead with the adjustment filing, submit whatever secondary evidence you have even if you don't have the actual birth certificate or the non-availability certificate, submit whatever evidence you have. And then USCIS will issue an RFE, usually a request for information, request for evidence. And you will have an opportunity to respond to that RFE at that time and provide the required evidence of birth at that time. Okay. So what about birth certificates which have typographical errors or spelling mistakes? So those are typically fine. There's different ways that you can spell the same name. The town or the city or the district that you were born in. There might be different variations of spelling. Even for the names of your parents, there might be different ways of spelling it. And so those typically are not an issue as long as it is evident it's the same person or the same place. You can also explain any typographical errors or variations in the spellings with a supporting affidavit if needed. Sometimes the name will have certain additions, some appendices like Kumar or Behen or Shri. Those are very common in India. Those also do not affect the validity of the birth certificate, so I would not worry about them. You can, if you want to be on the safe side, you can have a supporting affidavit explaining that this is a common addition to the name in the region where you were born. What about cases where the child's name itself is not on the birth certificate? So we've seen these certificates where all the details are there. All the details are there except for the name of the child, right? The date of birth, the gender, the parent's name, everything is there, but the child's name is left blank. And that's again common in some communities because the child would typically be named a little later after a ceremony and all of that. So for such cases too, it's usually not a problem. You can provide secondary evidence of the birth, and you can also include an affidavit from the parent saying that due to the naming convention, the child's name is not listed on the birth certificate, and the naming actually happens later. So that is also not a problem. Now we come to the next question. What if there is a material error in the birth certificate? So a material error would be the date of birth or the name of the child is completely different. If that's the case, then you should discuss that with your attorney or the person handling your matter. I have clients who've come and told me, hey, Diya, all my life, I thought I was born on the 15th of May. And then when I got my birth certificate, I found out that I was actually born on the 14th of my parents had given me the wrong date of birth, and that's what that's what we ended up using, listing everywhere, the passport, all applications, driver's license, everywhere. So that's, it's not the end of the world. It can, it can seem like it is an error, it is a material error, but it's not the end of the world. And USCIS should not hold that against you, because it's not the individual's fault that the parents, use the wrong date at the time of registration, or they had the incorrect date for other documents. What you should do in such cases, get a detailed affidavit from the parent, or a person, the guardian, your guardian, who was responsible for the registration and all the passport applications, or the name that the date of birth that they used when enrolling you in school, and explain what happened, explain the error, and maybe also give an attestation from your side that you will also now use the correct date of birth going forward. You will fix the passport and all of those things, and that should be all that you need to do. Keep in mind that the purpose of the birth certificate is to verify the identity of the person. And so, as long as that is met, there should not be any more problems. Okay. So, that's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover in general about birth certificates and the common queries that we get. Do we have any questions? Anything from the audience? Okay. So I think we have one question that's just come in. It says, what about cases where the father's or the mother's name is missing on the birth certificate? Is that a problem? Yes, it does happen. I mean, not very frequently, but again, what happens in India is that some municipalities have their own format, specific way of retaining the records. So yes, we have seen some cases where the mother's name or the father's name is missing on the birth certificate. Again, that's not a problem as long as the other information is there, such as the child's the actual date of birth, the location, the date, and at least one parent's name is listed. It should not be a problem. Again, back it up with secondary evidence such as the affidavit, and that should be good. Do we have another question? Yes, and this is, do I need to produce the original birth certificate? Yes, this is a great question. And yes, so the answer is that we don't need the original birth certificate at the time that we file the application for adjustment, right? The I-485 application, when we submit it to USCIS, we submit that with a copy of the person's birth certificate. But the original may be required if there is an interview. So if an interview, and most of the time the interview is waived these days because of the pandemic, but it used to be the practice for the last couple of years, 2-3 years before that, to have an interview at the final stage with an adjudication officer. And the officer would most likely ask for the original birth certificate to be reviewed. So you should have that with you. And if you don't have it, then better have a good explanation for why you don't have the original with you. You can also get what is called a certified copy from the municipality. So it's the way it works is you submit a fee, and they will produce a certified copy, and it will say that the certified copy is issued on so and so date, but the registration itself was done on so and so date. So that's important. They're just reprinting the certificate, right? And that could be a recent copy, but the registration should ideally have been done at the time of your birth, or around the time of your birth. Excuse me. And also, when you have the originals, if there are any supporting affidavits that were used from your parents or older relatives at that time, be sure to carry the originals of the affidavits as well. Okay. What happens when you're filing for your parents' green card and they have no birth certificates? Yes, again, a very common scenario. You might be filing the green card application for your parents who were born, let's say in the 50s or maybe before that. And at that time, the registration of birth was not very prevalent in India. So if you look at the reciprocity schedule, the schedule itself says clearly that registration was mandatory in India only from 1971 onwards. So USCIS does not, I mean, that's all you need to show to USCIS. You can explain that, hey, look, based on the reciprocity schedule, it was not the norm. So my parents obviously will not have the birth certificate from that time. So instead of that, you can give the secondary evidence that we discussed before, which is the affidavits, school living certificate, a ration card, and all of that fun stuff. You can also try get a certificate of non-availability from the municipality. Pretty much all municipalities in India now do issue the non-availability certificate. So there is a way to do it. You submit an application. There are also agencies. If you don't reside in India, there's also agencies that you can probably work with, and they will work with you to get the non-availability certificate. But again, that's not a problem as long as you have some secondary evidence to show the date of birth of your parent. You can utilize that. Okay. We have one more question. So this is about Indian citizens who are born abroad, such as in the UAE. Yes. So UAE is one of those countries where you could be born there, but you have an Indian passport and you are an Indian citizen, although your country of birth is UAE. In that case, you would look at the reciprocity schedule for the UAE, and there is a way to get the birth record from the UAE and any of those Middle Eastern states. That's just an example, but it holds good for any other country where you could be an Indian citizen, but you were actually born in a different country. And that's actually very helpful when it comes to immigration because then you go into a different queue. You don't go in the India queue. You go into the all countries chargeability road, and that definitely speeds things up. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I think that's pretty much it. I hope today's session was helpful. See you back next Thursday on our next session of 30 minutes with Chugh. Same time, 11 a.m. Pacific or 2 p.m. Eastern. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.